My name is Walter Brenner. I am 76 years old, and for the last 9 years I have lived alone in the house I once believed I would die in peacefully, surrounded by the memories of a life well lived. It is a grand old Victorian house tucked into the rolling green hills of Vermont, a home my late wife Eleanor and I bought when our second child was born. The house, with its creaky floors, slanted ceilings, and bay windows that catch the morning light just right, held more than just furniture and faded wallpaper. It held the entire scaffolding of my life. Every floorboard knew our footsteps. Every wall had echoed with the laughter and arguments of our children. Every window had reflected the slow passage of decades. And in the attic, still full of our stored memories, our children's drawings and Eleanor's boxes of letters, it felt like time folded in on itself. My days followed a strict rhythm, not because I had to, but because routine was the last remaining thread of order in a life that had become increasingly quiet. I'd rise at 6:30 a.m., sharp, a habit left over from years of teaching high school literature. Long before retirement hollowed out my calendar. I'd make coffee the old-fashioned way. No machines, just a kettle, a strainer, and a patience that age had granted me. Then I'd sit at the breakfast nook, the same one where Eleanor used to read the Sunday paper, and I'd try to read, though more often I'd find myself staring out the window into the garden she had once so lovingly tended. The hydrangeas still bloomed in June, and the lilies she planted every spring stubbornly returned without her. There was comfort in that quiet defiance of time. But comfort was not connection, and loneliness crept in like water under a door, slow, then all at once. My son, Dennis, used to visit once a month, sometimes with his wife, Marcia. But in the last 2 years, those visits dwindled into quarterly appearances, then eventually became phone calls that arrived with increasing irregularity and decreasing warmth. Always polite, always efficient, always just enough to tick the box of obligation. "How are you, Dad?" he would say, voice tight with distraction. "Do you need anything?" I'd always answer no, even when I did. I told myself I didn't want to be a burden, but the truth was simpler. I didn't believe they actually wanted to hear the truth. They weren't cruel, not exactly, but there was a kind of utilitarian coldness to their love, the kind that reduces affection to tasks and checklists. They were the kind of people who believed that love meant paying bills and scheduling appointments, not listening to your father recount stories you've already heard, or showing up unannounced just to sit on the porch for an hour. After Eleanor passed away, an aneurysm, swift and brutal, Dennis arranged the funeral with all the efficiency of a corporate manager. He handled the paperwork, the service, the obituary, but never once cried. I wept quietly for weeks, first in our bed, then on the porch swing where she used to knit in the evenings. I still have her favorite shawl draped over the back of my reading chair. It smells like dust now, but sometimes, if I press my face into it, I think I can still catch a faint trace of her lavender perfume. That's all I've had for years. Faint traces. My daughter, Emily, lives in Oregon, and I haven't seen her since Eleanor's funeral. We were never close after she married and moved west. She sends Christmas cards with photos of people I barely recognize. My grandchildren, now adults with careers and filtered Instagram smiles. None of them have visited me in over a decade. I've grown used to the solitude, or so I tell myself. There's a dignity in living alone, in making your own tea, in deciding when to water the plants, and when to let them wilt. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind taps the window panes and the house creaks like it's mourning too, I feel as though I've become invisible, as though I've already died, and no one noticed. Still, I tried to hold on to gratitude. I had my books, my garden, my memories, and the house, especially the house. It wasn't just a structure, it was a witness, a container for everything that once mattered. I kept it in decent shape, despite my arthritis and dwindling energy. I cleaned the gutters myself last fall, slowly and with great effort. I painted the porch railings the summer before. Whenever Dennis visited, he'd shake his head and tell me I shouldn't be climbing ladders. "You're not 20 anymore, Dad," he'd say, and I'd reply, "I'm not dead yet, either." He'd laugh, but there was never any warmth in it. A part of me always knew they didn't understand what this house meant to me. To them, it was real estate, an asset. To me, it was Eleanor's laughter bouncing off the kitchen walls, the sound of my son's first steps in the hallway, the corner of the living room where Emily insisted on camping out with her books and dolls. And it was also the place where Eleanor died. Right there, in our bedroom, holding my hand as her grip weakened and her eyes faded. I held on to this place not out of stubbornness, but because letting go of it felt like erasing all of that. So when Dennis brought up the idea of transitioning, as he called it, selling the house and moving into a retirement community, I resisted. Politely at first, then with increasing sharpness, he said I needed support, structure, social life. I said I needed space, silence, dignity. We reached an impasse. He backed off, or so I thought. The last time he and Marcia visited, he spent a lot of time wandering around the house, taking pictures with his phone, making quiet comments to her in the hallway. I asked what he was doing, and he said, "Just documenting for insurance, Dad. Nothing to worry about." I didn't believe him. I began to feel the shifting winds, small things at first, boxes disappearing from the attic. My papers moved from the drawer I always kept them in. I asked him once if he'd been in my office. He smiled and said no. Then came the suggestion that I move in with them, just for a few weeks while they fix up the place. I said no. Then Marcia called and insisted that it was temporary, that they just wanted to make things safer for me. They cared, they said. I wanted to believe them. I really did. But something in their voices sounded rehearsed, and a deeper part of me, the part that had learned to live alone, that had buried a wife, and survived the silence afterward, knew something wasn't right. The house had always felt like my ally, my fortress. But that winter, I started to feel like a guest in my own home. They brought contractors by when I was out shopping. One day I returned to find a ladder in the hallway and two strangers inspecting the moldings. Dennis said they were giving free consultations. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, then went upstairs and locked my bedroom door. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake listening to the wind, to the creaking timbers, to the silence growing heavier. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself my children still loved me. I told myself I still had control over my life. But the truth was, something had begun to slip. Not in my mind, as they would later claim, but around me, beneath me, and above me, in the attic, where they would soon try to hide me away, not just from the world, but from everything I had ever fought to preserve. It was early spring when Dennis arrived with Marcia, unannounced, pulling up into the gravel driveway in their black SUV like a pair of over-eager realtors preparing a property for staging. The grass was still pale and brittle from the long Vermont winter, and the trees had only begun to swell with the promise of leaves. I was in the kitchen, reheating a bowl of leftover stew, when I saw their car through the window. Something tightened in my chest. Not dread exactly, but not relief either. Visits from my son had become so rare that their sudden presence felt less like a blessing and more like a preamble to negotiation. I met them at the door, wiping my hands on a dish towel. Dennis didn't offer a hug. He simply said, "We need to talk," in that flat tone of his, like he was preparing for a business presentation rather than addressing his father. Marcia smiled that tight, toothless smile she reserved for people she didn't like but had to tolerate. I led them into the living room where the scent of lemon oil and old upholstery still clung to the furniture Eleanor and I had picked out decades ago. Dennis refused the armchair, preferring to stand, which made me feel like I was on trial. Marcia, meanwhile, perched on the edge of the couch, legs crossed tightly, eyes scanning the room like a home inspector. "Dad," Dennis began, his voice carefully modulated, "we've been thinking. This house is too much for you." I said nothing. I'd heard this before. He continued, "We're worried about you. There's too many stairs, too many rooms. The heating bills alone—" I cut him off. "Dennis, I've been living here just fine. I don't need you to audit my living expenses." Marcia jumped in. "Walter, it's not just about the bills. We're talking about your safety. What if you fall? What if something happens and no one finds out for days?" She paused, as if the horror of that possibility should break me open. It didn't. "You want me to leave?" I said quietly. Dennis sighed. "Just temporarily, just while we do some renovations. The place needs work, Dad. You know that. There's mold in the basement. There's a crack in the foundation. It's not safe." I knew the house wasn't perfect. Old homes rarely are. But I also knew that Dennis had never cared much for its quirks or its history. He always called it the money pit, and suggested we sell even before Eleanor died. "We want you to stay with us for a little while," Marcia said, her voice softening in practiced sympathy. "We've set up the guest room. It'll be cozy. You'll have your own bathroom." I looked between the two of them. Something felt off. There was urgency in their tone, a brittle edge beneath the veneer of concern. "Why now?" I asked. "What's changed?" Dennis hesitated, but only briefly. "We just think it's time. We want to do right by you." I didn't believe them, but I also didn't have the strength to argue. Not anymore. Weeks of subtle gaslighting had chipped away at my sense of security. Papers moved, conversations half-remembered, quiet insinuations that maybe I was getting forgetful, maybe it was time to let the younger generation take over. I agreed, though every cell in my body screamed against it. 2 days later, they returned with moving boxes. "Not for my things, just a few of them," they said. "Essentials only, but for the rest of the house." "We're going to have a crew in," Dennis explained as he taped up books and photo albums. "It'll be easier if the place is cleared out." I asked where everything would go. "Storage," Marcia chirped. "It's all insured." I stood in the living room watching them pack away my life. The house felt like it was exhaling me. That afternoon, they drove me to their home. A suburban colonial in a development with perfectly manicured lawns and no personality. Their guest room was not ready, as it turned out. Instead, they led me upstairs, through a hallway that smelled of plastic air fresheners and faint mildew, to a narrow door at the end. "Just for a few days," Dennis said. "We'll make the guest room available soon. We just have to get the treadmill and boxes out." The attic was dimly lit, with low ceilings and a single small window overlooking the neighbor's backyard. The bed was an old cot covered in a scratchy wool blanket. A folding chair and a nightstand made up the rest of the furnishings. There was a tiny space heater plugged into the wall, already humming when I stepped inside. "You'll be fine here for now," Marcia said brightly, too brightly. "We'll bring you your meals. Make yourself comfortable." She handed me a glass of water and a bottle of Tylenol, just in case. I wanted to laugh or cry. Instead, I nodded. That night, I discovered that the door locked from the outside. I only noticed it when I tried to use the bathroom and found the doorknob wouldn't turn. I knocked. No answer. I banged harder, panic blooming in my chest. Finally, Dennis opened it, irritation flickering across his face. "You should have called down," he said. "We didn't know you needed something." I had no phone. No way to call down. "The guest room will be ready soon," he repeated, but it never was. For the next several days I was confined to the attic. Meals were brought at irregular hours, often cold. Sometimes I was offered toast and tea, other times, nothing at all. I had to knock to be let out, but sometimes no one answered for hours. I listened to them talk downstairs, Marcia on the phone with someone about estate liquidation, Dennis whispering about market readiness and valuable antiques. I heard them walking through the house, heard furniture being dragged, the muffled thump of boxes dropped onto the floor. My possessions, I realized. My books, my records, Eleanor's wedding china. They were cataloging it all, preparing it for sale. On the third day I asked to go home. Marcia smiled and said, "Soon, Walter, very soon. The house just isn't safe right now." That night I tried to stay awake, listening for anything that might confirm my suspicions. Around midnight, I heard Dennis's voice drifting up through the floor vents. "The lawyer said we just need a doctor to sign the papers," he said. "If we get the incompetency declared, we can fast-track the estate sale. He's barely aware of what's happening anyway." Marcia replied something I couldn't catch. My blood turned cold. I realized then that I wasn't just being protected or sheltered. I was being removed, erased. And the worst part? They thought I wouldn't notice, that I was too old, too slow, too lost to fight back. They didn't understand that isolation sharpens the mind, that the silence they thought would dull me only made me more alert. I began to plan, quietly, carefully. Because if they wanted me locked away while they sold my life out from under me, they would soon learn that I still remembered where everything important was kept, including the documents they had no idea I still had. Days bled into one another like ink spilled across parchment, each one identical to the last, each one marked by the same cramped attic ceiling, the same dim light leaking through the tiny, dusty window, and the same hollow ache of uncertainty pulsing through my chest. I had become something less than a guest and more than a prisoner, an inconvenient obligation boxed away out of sight, while my son and daughter-in-law sifted through the remains of my life below. At first I told myself it was temporary. I repeated their words like a mantra, just until the renovations are done, just until we sort things out, just until the guest room is ready. But as days passed and no mention of progress was made, I began to understand that this wasn't about convenience or safety. This was strategic, deliberate. They wanted me out of the way, quietly, without confrontation. And slowly I started to see how far their cruelty extended, not through raised voices or slammed doors, but through neglect dressed as concern, through a careful architecture of subtle humiliations and erasures. Meals became more sporadic. Sometimes they forgot entirely. I'd wait by the door, listening to the sounds of clinking plates and conversation downstairs, hunger twisting in my gut while no one came. When I knocked, sometimes no one answered. Other times, Marcia would appear, her face composed into a mask of irritation, covered by a thin layer of politeness. "You need to be patient, Walter," she'd say. "We're doing our best." And then she'd hand me a plate of food, so cold it felt refrigerated. I stopped asking for things. I stopped knocking. Pride mixed with despair, until I could no longer distinguish one from the other. My body ached from the cot. My knees throbbed from climbing and descending the narrow attic stairs whenever they deigned to let me out. The single bathroom I was allowed to use, when permitted, was on the second floor and always stocked with the bare minimum: a single roll of toilet paper, a bar of cracked soap, a towel that never seemed dry. I began to feel as though they were testing the limits of my endurance, as if my slow decline was something they expected, something they counted on. At night, I lay awake listening. I heard them laugh, heard the faint buzz of television, the clinking of wine glasses, the murmurs of conversation too quiet to make out but not so quiet that I didn't understand the tone. One night I heard Marcia on the phone. "Yes, he's still here," she said, her voice as smooth as silk. "No, he hasn't asked about the house. Honestly, I don't think he remembers much anymore. We're looking into getting someone to assess him formally, just to be safe." She paused, then laughed softly. "Yes, we have the power of attorney. At least, we're almost there." I sat frozen on the cot, that word echoing in my head. Power of attorney. They were moving faster than I thought. I realized I had underestimated how far they were willing to go. What once seemed like passive manipulation now revealed itself as a calculated strategy. I wasn't just being ignored or sidelined. I was being prepared, like a property marked for demolition, like a story rewritten before I could protest. I began to notice more missing things. The box that held my service medals was gone. The ledger I kept in my desk, documenting every repair I'd made to the house since 1981, vanished. Framed photographs, silverware, even Eleanor's jewelry box. Everything was being quietly stripped away. I knew in the marrow of my bones that they were selling my belongings. I overheard Dennis telling someone on speakerphone about a buyer who's interested in the sideboard, and Marcia responding, "We'll let you know after we sort the papers." Sort the papers. They were preparing to liquidate everything while keeping me locked away. But they had made one mistake. In their haste to sanitize the house, they hadn't bothered to clear the attic fully. Perhaps they assumed I was too frail to go through old boxes, or too disoriented to remember what they contained. They were wrong. One afternoon while they were out, Dennis had left the attic door unlocked, probably by accident. I rummaged through an old trunk near the back wall, one I hadn't touched in years. Beneath a layer of moth-eaten blankets and brittle newspaper clippings, I found a faded manila envelope. Inside were original documents Eleanor and I had signed when we refinanced the house years ago, including the deed that confirmed the property was under my name alone. Not Dennis's, not Marcia's, mine. There was also the will, notarized and unaltered, and a durable power of attorney document, unsigned. That was the key. They had tried to convince me I had already signed it. They even produced a blurry photocopy once, months ago, when I questioned a withdrawal Dennis made, but the original remained, untouched, in this envelope. I held the papers in my hands for a long time, my fingers trembling. Not just from age, but from the surge of clarity that rushed through me. This was my life, my proof, my leverage. I was not losing my mind. I was being buried alive. I returned the documents to the envelope and stuffed them beneath the mattress on the cot, in a place no one would think to look. That night, I didn't sleep. I rehearsed what I would do if they tried to push me further. I knew I couldn't confront them outright. They would gaslight me again, perhaps call a doctor to label me senile, confused. No, I needed to wait. I needed to act carefully, deliberately. The way I used to play chess with Eleanor on rainy afternoons, each move calculated 5 steps in advance. But the mask I wore, the mask of compliance, began to slip. Marcia noticed first. She brought me lunch and saw I hadn't eaten the dinner from the night before. "Walter, you're not keeping up your strength," she said, her voice syrupy but taut. I looked her in the eye and said, "I prefer my food warm." She blinked, taken aback. "Well, we're doing what we can. This isn't a hotel." I didn't answer. I let silence sit between us, heavy and accusatory. She shifted uncomfortably, then left. Later, I heard her whispering to Dennis, The words weren't clear, but the tone was unmistakable. They knew I was slipping out from under their control. They'd have to accelerate their plan. I had to be ready. That night, I listened at the attic vent again. Dennis was angry. "He's getting suspicious," he said. "We should have acted faster." Marcia's voice was sharper than usual. "We can't move forward until the paperwork is filed. We need a doctor to sign off. Until then, we're stuck." Dennis muttered something about nursing facilities and evaluation. I lay back on the cot, staring at the dark ceiling, counting each breath. I knew the storm was coming. The question was whether I could move first, whether I could make one final gambit before they buried me completely. I didn't know yet how I would do it, but I knew one thing for certain. They had underestimated the wrong old man, and that mistake would cost them everything. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the sun filters through the blinds in delicate patterns, when the world outside carries on unaware, when cruelty wraps itself in domestic routine so tightly that even violence begins to look like care. Marcia had left early that morning, claiming she needed to meet a friend from church, though I'd never known her to attend any place of worship. Dennis remained downstairs most of the day, pacing, speaking into his phone in clipped tones that reached me only as shadows of meaning through the floorboards. I stayed quiet, moving with slow purpose around the attic. The manila envelope with my documents now tucked securely inside the lining of an old winter coat Eleanor had sewn for me years ago. I had ripped the stitching open by hand the night before and slid the envelope into place, then stitched it back with thread from a forgotten sewing kit I found in a box of Eleanor's belongings. My fingers ached, my eyesight blurred. But when I finished, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a calm I hadn't known in weeks. I was ready. And then, just after 3 p.m, I heard Dennis climbing the stairs, his footsteps unusually slow and deliberate. The attic door creaked open and he stepped inside, holding a cup of tea and something else in his other hand, a small white plastic bottle with a red cap. "You haven't been sleeping?" he said, his voice carrying the peculiar gentleness of someone who knows they're about to lie and doesn't mind. I thought this might help. He handed me the tea first, then the bottle. It was unmarked, but I recognized the shape. Over-the-counter sleeping pills, maybe, or something stronger. "You'll feel better," he added, watching me too closely. I stared at the bottle, then back at him. "You ever take these yourself?" I asked, my voice steady. He smiled. "Sometimes, when I have trouble shutting off my brain." He placed the bottle on the crate beside my cot and stood there, expecting something. Obedience, gratitude, defeat. I gave him none of those. "I'll try it later," I said. "Maybe tonight." He nodded slowly, then turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "Try to rest, Dad. You've been agitated lately. Marcia and I are worried. If things don't improve, we might need to talk to someone. About your care." I didn't respond. He closed the door gently behind him, and this time I heard the click of the lock. The sleeping pills remained untouched. That night, as the moonlight drew skeletal branches across the attic walls, I made my decision. I would not wait for them to render me invisible. I would not allow myself to become a whisper of a man, confined to memory and half-truths. I would leave. Not just escape the attic, but reclaim what was mine. My name, my home, my freedom. I waited until I heard the unmistakable rhythm of Dennis and Marcia's sleep, the house falling into the hush of deep night. Then I rose, pulled the coat from its hook, and slipped it over my shoulders. The documents pressed lightly against my spine like a silent witness to what I was about to do. I turned the doorknob slowly. It gave. He hadn't locked it. Perhaps it was arrogance. perhaps carelessness, or perhaps he thought the pills would do their work and I'd be too groggy to move. I stepped out into the hallway barefoot, each step muffled against the carpet. The house was dark, save for the blue glow of a charging phone on the kitchen counter. I didn't touch anything. I didn't even breathe too deeply. I made it to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped out into the night. The air hit me like a baptism, cool, sharp, full of life. I walked fast at first, then slower as the weight of the cold crept into my bones. I didn't have a plan beyond that moment, but I knew I had to put distance between me and that house. I reached the end of the street and turned right, into a part of the neighborhood I barely knew, hoping I might find someone, anyone, who could help. That's when the porch light snapped on. A woman stood at her door in a robe, holding a phone. She looked startled. "Sir, are you okay?" I nodded, then shook my head. "I need to get to a lawyer," I said. "My son's trying to steal my house." It came out flat, absurd. I saw the doubt flicker in her eyes. "Can I call someone for you?" she asked. "A doctor? The police?" "No police," I said quickly. "Not yet." I gave her Martin's name, my old lawyer, and asked if she could find his number. She invited me in, and I stood in her foyer as she searched online, glancing at me every few seconds as though she feared I might collapse or explode. She dialed and handed me the phone. Martin answered, groggy but alert. "Walter?" he said. "Are you all right?" I told him everything in as few words as possible. He didn't hesitate. "Come to my office in the morning," he said. "Bring the documents. We'll stop this." I thanked the woman, declined her offer to stay the night, and walked to the bus station a few blocks away, using the emergency cash I had hidden in my shoe to buy a one-way ticket back to town. I didn't sleep on the bus. I sat with my coat wrapped tightly around me, my hands clenched in my lap, and my heart pounding with fear and resolve. I didn't know what Dennis would do when he found me gone. I didn't know if Marcia would report me missing or worse. But I did know one thing with absolute certainty. The next move was mine. The bus ride back into town was long and quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around a man's mind like gauze, dulling everything except the single sharp edge of thought that keeps him upright. I sat rigidly beneath my coat, the documents pressed against my back like a second spine, trying not to dwell on what might happen next. I replayed every step, every whispered conversation I had heard from the attic, every cold glance from Marcia, every slippery sentence Dennis had uttered in that patronizing tone of his, and I could feel the shape of their plan unfolding fully in my mind now, no longer vague shadows but a meticulously laid-out sequence of betrayal, isolate, discredit, seize. They had never intended for me to return to the house. In their eyes, I had already been erased, filed away like a tax form, folded neatly into the box marked "too old to notice," too tired to fight back. But they had forgotten who I was before I became this quiet old man who stirred tea in the kitchen. Alone. They had forgotten that I had spent 35 years teaching literature to restless teenagers, teaching them to read between the lines, to catch what wasn't said, to uncover motives through subtext. They had forgotten that before arthritis slowed my steps and grief hollowed my chest, I was a man who did not yield. When I arrived in town just after dawn, the streets were still quiet, a soft mist clinging to the sidewalks like memory. I made my way slowly to Martin's office, arriving a full hour before it opened. I sat on the stone bench across the street, watching the front door, rehearsing again what I would say. When Martin finally arrived, carrying a paper cup of coffee and a stack of mail, he stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me. "Walter," he said, his voice filled with concern. "What the hell happened?" Inside his office, I laid everything out. What they had done, what they had said, what I had overheard, and finally what I had found. I removed the envelope from my coat, laid the documents on his desk one by one, the deed in my name alone, the unsigned power of attorney, Eleanor's last will, with her unmistakable signature and the notary's stamp. Martin reviewed them carefully, his lips pressed into a firm line. "This," he said slowly, "is your salvation." "And your sword." He explained what I had already suspected. Dennis and Marcia had been laying the groundwork to declare me legally incompetent. With a signed power of attorney, they could have emptied my bank accounts, sold the house, and placed me in a care facility without my consent. It would have been clean, legal, and irreversible. But the document was unsigned. That single detail unraveled everything. "We need to act fast," Martin said. "First, we block any claims to guardianship. Then, we secure your property. And you," he looked at me over the rims of his glasses, "you need to disappear for a while." I nodded. I had no intention of going back to Dennis's house. Martin helped arrange a temporary rental in a retirement complex across town, quiet and anonymous. The room was small but clean, with a view of a duck pond and a modest kitchenette. I paid 2 months in advance using my checking account, one they didn't know existed, and bought a cheap phone with a new number. I contacted the bank, froze my main accounts, and revoked every access Dennis had ever been granted. Then I filed an official complaint regarding the suspected misuse of my financial information, requesting an internal audit. The bank manager, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, listened carefully as I explained. "You're not the first parent," she said quietly, "but you might be the first to fight back before it's too late." While Martin drafted letters, I went to the storage unit where I kept a few old belongings that hadn't made it into the house. Inside a battered filing cabinet was something I hadn't touched in years, a journal Eleanor had kept during the first decade of our marriage. It wasn't long, just scribbled thoughts, lists, quotes from books she liked, but reading it again reminded me why I had stayed in that house so long, why I had clung to its walls and rooms and fading smells. It was never about bricks. It was about her. Meanwhile, Dennis began to panic. When I didn't return, when I didn't call, when my accounts became inaccessible and the phone rang with only silence, he must have realized something was wrong. Within a week, Martin received a call from their lawyer. He was polite but probing, asking if Martin had heard from me, hinting that Dennis and Marcia were worried for my well-being. Martin played dumb. "I thought Walter was with them," he said innocently. "Did something happen?" The lawyer grew cautious. He asked if I'd signed any recent medical releases or powers of attorney. Martin, bless him, said, "If he had, he would have done it here, and he hasn't been in." By then, I had already arranged for a medical evaluation. Martin had insisted on it, preemptive strategy. 3 separate doctors evaluated me independently, a neurologist, a psychologist, and a general practitioner. All 3 reports stated clearly that I was of sound mind, fully capable of making legal and financial decisions. We compiled those evaluations into a formal statement, notarized, and filed with the county clerk's office. Now, if Dennis tried to challenge my competence, we had professional, legally admissible evidence to crush him with. But the most damning piece came next. With Martin's help, I filed a formal request for access logs from the real estate platform where Dennis had listed my house without my consent. Using his real name, his email, his signature, they had already begun showing the property to prospective buyers. My house, the one I had never signed away. My home. We took screenshots, printed logs, captured everything. Martin filed an injunction preventing the sale of the house pending further investigation. Then we drafted a cease and desist letter delivered by courier to Dennis's office. It arrived at noon. By 12:45, he had called me 6 times. I didn't answer. I knew that silence was the only language he would understand now. Later that evening, I received an email from him. It began with false warmth. "Dad, I've been so worried," then slid into accusation. "Why are you doing this?" And ended with veiled threats. "If you persist, we'll have to take legal steps of our own." I didn't reply. I forwarded it to Martin. 2 days later, I saw Marcia outside my storage unit. She was standing by her car, sunglasses on, arms folded, staring at the entrance as though she could will me to appear. I waited across the street until she left. That night, someone knocked on the door of my apartment. I didn't open it. The knock came again. Then silence. I reported it the next morning to the building manager, who promised to review the security footage. I didn't need to see it. I knew it was Dennis. They were spiraling. Their carefully constructed narrative, the helpless father, the well-meaning children, was collapsing. And in its place, the truth stood like a storm on the horizon, gathering weight, ready to strike. Martin moved to the next phase, reclaiming legal and sole control over the house. He filed a suit for declarative ownership, citing fraud, attempted coercion, and elder abuse. We submitted the original deed, the forged attempts at guardianship, the house listing, and the evaluations of my mental fitness. It was a mountain of evidence. The judge scheduled a hearing. When Dennis and Marcia received the summons, they finally stopped calling. The silence that followed was different, darker, more dangerous. I knew they were regrouping, plotting their counterattack, but now the fight was public. Now they couldn't hide behind polite smiles and softly spoken lies. They would have to stand in a courtroom and explain themselves, and I would be there too. Not just to defend myself, but to confront them. To show them, once and for all, that I had not disappeared, that I had not surrendered, that I remembered everything, and I was done being quiet. The courthouse sat like a slab of stone under a gray, oppressive sky, the kind of sky that threatens rain but never delivers, only lingers, bloated and low, casting everything in a dull and exhausted light. I arrived early, dressed in a plain charcoal suit Eleanor had once insisted I keep just in case. And though it hung looser on my frame than it had years ago, it still felt like armor. Martin met me at the entrance, a thick folder clutched under his arm, his face calm, but unsmiling. Inside, the courtroom was cold, lit by fluorescents that drained the life from everyone seated beneath them. Dennis and Marcia arrived just before the session began, both dressed as if for church or charity, their expressions tight, their body language rehearsed. Marcia carried a leather binder with the precision of someone convinced it contains truth. Dennis avoided my eyes entirely. When the bailiff called our case, I stood slowly, the ache in my knees reminding me of the years I carried on my back like invisible luggage. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, sharp-eyed and efficient, her voice devoid of empathy but not hostile. She asked for opening remarks, and Martin rose, speaking clearly, deliberately, laying out the case like a narrative carved into stone: elder isolation, attempted financial control, property manipulation, unlawful listing and sale. He referenced documents by name, held up notarized affidavits, presented medical evaluations in triplicate. He was calm but relentless, each word striking with the weight of evidence, not anger. When it was Dennis's turn, his lawyer adopted a tone of syrupy concern, painting me as confused, lost, emotionally unstable, hinting at episodes that had never occurred. Our clients, the lawyer said, nodding toward Dennis and Marcia, acted only out of love and caution. Mr. Brenner, while deeply loved by his family, has shown signs, subtle but troubling, of cognitive decline. His children intervened not for personal gain, but to protect him, and by extension, his assets. I almost laughed at that, but didn't. The judge looked at me then. "Mr. Brenner, are you prepared to speak?" I nodded and stood. The courtroom tilted slightly as I rose. Too little sleep, too much anticipation. But I steadied myself and walked to the stand. I spoke not with theatrics, but with clarity. I spoke of the attic, of the locked door, of the cold meals and colder silence. I described the missing items, the overheard conversations, the attempts to medicate me into submission. I spoke of Eleanor's voice in the walls of the house they tried to erase. I laid out the documents I had hidden, one by one, and with each paper the weight of their intentions became harder to deny. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse beyond what I could prove. But when I finished, the courtroom was silent, heavy with something raw and uneasy. Dennis's lawyer tried to rebut, but the judge held up her hand. "I've heard enough," she said, her tone clipped. This matter is clear. In her ruling, she acknowledged the evidence of attempted coercion, the unlawful listing of the property, and the absence of any legal basis for guardianship. She restored full legal control of the property and all financial accounts to me. She also instructed the district attorney to consider reviewing the case for further investigation under elder abuse statutes. As the judge's gavel came down, I felt a tremor, not of fear but of release. It was over, at least the part that needed proving. But in the hallway after the hearing, the final blow came. Dennis followed me out, his steps quick and uneven. "Why are you doing this?" he hissed, his voice no longer polished, but raw. "You've ruined us. You've ruined everything." I turned to him, slowly, deliberately, and for the first time in months, I looked my son directly in the eye. "You did that the moment you locked the door behind me," I said. "The moment you stopped seeing your father and started seeing an asset." Marcia approached then, her face contorted not with sorrow, but with fury barely masked by shame. "You could have just given us the house," she said. "We deserved it. We took care of you." "You caged me," I said. "You starved me. You stripped my life away piece by piece and called it kindness." They had no reply. Martin placed his hand gently on my shoulder and we walked away, leaving them standing in the hallway with their binders and their bitterness. Outside, the sky was still gray, but somehow it felt brighter. Maybe it was the wind, maybe the silence that no longer pressed down on me like a weight, or maybe just the simple knowledge that I had not been erased. I had spoken, I had been heard, and now I was free. The house was exactly as I remembered it, and yet somehow entirely different, as if it had held its breath during my absence and only now dared to exhale. When I opened the front door with the keys, I had reissued in my name alone. The scent of old wood, dust, and something faintly floral. Eleanor's lavender sachets, long forgotten in dresser drawers, rose up to greet me like a memory leaning close. Light poured in through the windows again, unobstructed, unapologetic. The curtains were still drawn back the way I had always left them, though I noticed that some of the furniture had been moved, and a few pieces were missing entirely, sold no doubt during the brief reign of Dennis and Marcia. But the bones of the house were intact. The soul of it, though bruised, had survived. I walked through each room slowly, touching door frames, brushing my hand along the worn banister, opening cupboards and drawers just to be sure they were still mine. In the hallway closet, I found one of Eleanor's old scarves, and without thinking, I wrapped it once around my neck and left it there. Upstairs in the bedroom, I stood for a long time in the exact place where I had held her hand as she took her last breath. I whispered her name aloud, not because I thought she could hear me, but because I needed to hear it again in that room, from my mouth, as proof that she had existed, and I still remembered. I didn't cry. There was a strange peace in the stillness, not joy, not relief, but a quiet reclamation of something that had been almost taken from me. I stayed there for 3 days without seeing anyone, without speaking, except to the house itself, as if it were an old friend finally returned. I swept, aired out the rooms, made tea in the kitchen using the same kettle I'd used for decades. I set Eleanor's photograph on the mantel. I placed the deed in the desk drawer in the study where it had always belonged. The mailbox began to fill again with things bearing my name. I signed up for a daily newspaper. I called the plumber, the electrician, and the roofer. Small things deferred too long. I did not tell Dennis I had returned. I did not tell anyone. I owed them nothing. One morning, perhaps a week after my return, a letter arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, in shaky handwriting. I didn't know they were doing that to you. I thought you were resting upstairs. I'm sorry, Grandpa. I miss you. Ryan. Ryan? My grandson? He must have overheard things in that house that no child should hear. I had no reply. Not yet. But I placed the letter in the same box that held Eleanor's. There would be time. A few days later, I received a call from the local police. A quiet voice told me Dennis and Marcia were being investigated for elder abuse and attempted fraud. They might face charges, or maybe just public shame, but either way the world would now know what they had tried to do. I listened in silence, thanked the officer, and hung up. I felt no victory. I felt no vindication. Only completion. What they did was theirs to carry. What I had reclaimed was mine to keep. In the evenings now, I sit on the porch again, a wool blanket draped across my knees, a cup of tea cooling in my hands. The garden needs work, but the hydrangeas are trying. The wind comes off the hill the way it always did. Sometimes I speak aloud, not to anyone in particular, but perhaps to Eleanor, or to the memory of the man I almost became if I hadn't fought back. I think often about the attic, the way they turned it into a cage, the way I might still be up there, forgotten, if I hadn't trusted the instinct that told me I was not yet done, that I had not lost my name, or my house, or my truth. They tried to erase me, but the record stands, and I am still here.